and it is so good to be back here. The people of Kings Lynn Baptist Church send their love, and they issue you an invitation should you ever find yourself in Kings Lynn, or if you are ever looking for a church day out. You are very, very welcome to come and receive some good old West Norfolk hospitality. But it really is so wonderful to be back, to see so many friends again. It's pretty emotional, actually. So thank you for the invitation. We love you. We miss you. Please do keep in touch. We do love to hear from you and pray for you. And when people pop along to visit John and Deb on their way through, John and Deb drove past my front door, had a holiday in Norfolk, never popped in. I'm not bitter, but when people pop in on their way through and visit, it really is wonderful. I was talking to a wise friend this week, trying to work out what passage to preach on, and he said to me, just, you know what, you're going to be with people that you love. People that love you. So go and just pick a passage that you love and something that you can get passionate about, something that excites you. So I did, and here it is, the parable of the Good Samaritan, probably one of the most famous and well-known of the parables. I mean, if you were to go out on the street now, people who are out on the street today are there because they're not in church. So if you were to go out there now and ask anyone on the street to name a parable, what do you reckon they'd come up with? Prodigal son, parable of the sower, and the Good Samaritan. It really is there, isn't it, in the top three. In fact, I can't think of any others that people would probably be able to rattle off like that. Now this, before we start, it's good to make clear that this is a parable. It's a story that Jesus told in order to make a point. And it's one that Jesus told really quite early in his teaching ministry. And it is a very well-known parable. In some ways, it's too well-known, isn't it? And because we know it so well, we can recite it. We think we know what it says. We think we know what it means. But does it actually say what we think it says? The danger is that we turn this parable into a fable, a story with a moral. And the moral of the story is be good and be helpful. But surely this is more than a call to be a good person, more than a call to help people, though they are vitally important things to do. I mean, the worry is, have we turned Christianity just into be good, be nice, and be nice to other people? But Jesus wasn't killed for being nice. And to complicate it even more, the meaning of words changes over time, doesn't it? I mean, Samaritans, what do you think of when you hear the word Samaritans? You think of this organisation that helps people. You can call them up any time of day or night. You can talk to them and they will listen. So Samaritan in our culture is a really positive word. But it didn't used to be. It wasn't. Because Samaritans and Jews hated each other. Hated each other. Oh, you've missed this. Quick history lesson. Those of you that don't like history, you know what to do. Fingers in your ears. I'll tell you when we get to the end. History lesson. Israel was made up of 12 tribes. 8 to the north, 2 to the south. And the 2 in the south were Judah and Benjamin. They became the Jews. And Jerusalem and the temple were in the south. Now, King David, he ruled over a united Israel, but then it split into 2, and the north and the south had different kings, different rules, did things differently. Fast forward a bit to the exile, when the people were taken out of their homeland. Remember, we looked at this way back in lockdown when we read through Isaiah together. The northern kingdom was taken into exile first by Assyria. And then, some years later, the southern kingdom was taken into exile by Babylon. Remember the psalm made famous by Boney M? By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept. Now, the thing is, the northern and the southern tribes, they dealt with exile very differently. The northern tribes, well, they assimilated. They intermarried with the Assyrians. They settled with them. And they settled with non-Hebrews, with Gentiles. But they themselves were still descended from Abraham. And they very much still saw themselves as children of promise. Okay, they still saw themselves as the children of the Abrahamic promises and all of that. And they lived in the north, up and around Samaria. Then you had the southern tribes, and they had what they thought stayed pure. When you actually read the Old Testament and see how they behaved, there's not much purity. But by staying pure, they didn't intermarry with the Babylonians. At every point, they knew that they were in exile, and they cried out to God to save them, that they could go home, until eventually King Cyrus allowed them to return from exile to their homeland and to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. And they, the southern tribes, the Jewish people, they hated the northern tribes with a passion, because they believed that the northern tribes had betrayed their heritage, they had intermarried, they had not stayed pure, and thus began this massive hatred. The level of hatred between the two groups cannot be overstated. I mean, if you look to the Middle East now and everything that's going on there now, the fighting, the bombing, the hatred between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it is very comparable. The Israeli people wouldn't have just crossed the road to go past a Samaritan person. They would have been more likely to go and give them a kicking and give them a beating. So we're all gathered around Jesus. That's the setting for this story. We're gathered around, fingers out your ears, we've finished the history bit. So we're gathered around Jesus when an expert in the law, some translations call him a lawyer, he asks Jesus a question. And you know when some people ask you a question, you know they don't really want you to answer. They're not asking for a debate or for information. This man was an expert in the law. He knew the answer to the question that he asked. Instead, all he was trying to do was to catch Jesus out. So he says to Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" It's a question he knows the answer to. So Jesus turns it back on him. And he says, "Well, you expert in the law, what does the law say?" And of course, the man knows what the law says. So he tells Jesus, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself." It's easy to say. It's very difficult to do, because what it translates to basically is be perfect. Be perfect. Live in perfect love and live out perfect love. Jesus says, yeah, that's exactly right. If you do that, then you will be saved. The problem is it's impossible, isn't it? No one can do it. Only one person ever in the entire history of the world has ever lived a perfect life, and that is Jesus. Well, the expert in the law, he realises that Jesus has tied him up in knots. It's like, you know, when you're playing chess with someone and you think you're on top, and then the next thing you know, they move a piece and you're in checkmate. And no matter where you turn, no matter what you do, you're in checkmate. You know that they've got you. Well, the expert in the law was in checkmate. Jesus had used his own law to tie him up in knots. But this lawyer, this expert in the law, isn't giving up without a fight. So he asks Jesus, "Well then, who even is my neighbour?" Isn't that such a hard question? Isn't that such a hard question? Who then is my neighbour? And to be fair, for this man, God was the God of Israel, and his neighbour was his Jewish neighbour. But rather than give a straight answer, Jesus tells this story. And it's a story that I want to respectfully suggest that we might have got a bit back to front. So let's look at the story. We've got a man travelling on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was set upon by robbers who beat him, took everything he had, including his clothes. And they took his money and they left him there half dead. Maybe they thought he was dead. Who knows? But there was the man in the road with no way of helping himself. And so he lays in the road, utterly helpless. And firstly, along comes a priest. And the priest sees the man laying in the road and he passes by on the other side. And we, in our culture today, we go, oh. But to be fair, priests would have travelled that road fairly often. And they would have either have been heading to Jerusalem to carry out their priestly duties, or they would be on their way back home from having carried out their priestly duties. Now, if the priest was travelling towards Jerusalem, then uppermost in his mind would have been the need to keep himself ritually pure, ritually clean, so that he would be able to perform his duties. If he contracted impurity, because you could catch that in those days, if he contracted impurity by, for instance, touching a dead person, he would have had to go through a long and tedious process of ritual cleansing before he would even be allowed anywhere near the temple. So maybe that's the reason he didn't help. Or maybe there's another reason. There's always another reason, isn't there? The wounded man has had his clothes stolen. Did you notice that? I didn't notice that initially. He's had his clothes stolen and he's laying there, he's unconscious on the ground. So just by looking, no one can tell, either by his speech or by his clothes, what type of man he was and where he was from. Now, there's a traditional Jewish teaching dating from a couple of hundred years before Jesus lived that said that you should know the person that you are helping, just in case you're found to be helping sinners by mistake. And a priest might have been reluctant to help this unidentifiable stranger on the road because he might have turned out to be a sinner, or even worse, a Gentile. And the expert in the law would have known about this teaching. So would the people listening. So, you know, as we draw breath and go, oh, can't believe the priest walked by and didn't help, the people wouldn't have been shocked or upset that the priest passed by, because their teaching says, just in case, you better not help him. But the man is still there, laying in the road, helpless. So next, along comes a Levite. Now, a Levite is a member of the priestly tribe of Levi. All priests were Levites, not all Levites were priests. Okay, you get that. But Levites would have been the people that assist with the priestly duties at the temple. And you know the story, we've just read it. The Levite, possibly taking his cues from the priest ahead of him, also crosses over and passes by on the other side of the road. Now, if I was to stand up here and say, I want to tell you a story. Oh, I went a bit all Max Bygraves for a minute, didn't I? I want to tell you a story. An Englishman, an Irishman, who would you expect to walk by next? A Scotsman, exactly. And Jesus is using the same sort of thing here. A priest and a Levite have walked by, so in the story, the people would then be expecting the next person to walk by to be an ordinary Jewish person, one of them, and they would be the hero of the story, you know, victory for the ordinary man. Except it's not a Jew that Jesus introduces next. It's their sworn enemy, a Samaritan. And it's the Samaritan that doesn't care about whether the helpless man is a Jew or a Gentile. He doesn't care if he's a saint or a sinner. It's the Samaritan that risks his own safety by taking the injured man to a hostel. Out of his own time and his own pocket, he bandages his wounds, and out of his own money, he pays in advance for the injured man's care, promising to drop in and check on his way back that the man is being looked after. I struggle to pass on to you the level of shock that there would have been when the people who were gathered around heard this twist in the story. I mean, I don't know who for you or for us is the most despised person that you'd be almost ashamed to receive help from. I mean, I wonder if the unconscious man would rather have been left to die where he was than be helped by a Samaritan. And Jesus turns the question back on itself again when he says to the lawyer, which of these three proved themselves to be a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And even then, if you look at the passage, even then the lawyer can't say the word Samaritan, can he? He says, the one who helped him. Even then, he cannot form the word Samaritan on his lips. And that speaks volumes, doesn't it? And Jesus says, you go and do the same. Not what the priest did or what the Levite did. Not what God's chosen people did, but what your sworn enemy did. And that would not have won him many friends, but it would have won him some enemies. It's like if we were to tell the story today in today's language, I don't know, a vicar, a Baptist minister and an imam go down the road, do as the imam did. Or a man, a woman and a transgender person walked along the road, do as the transgender person did. Or an English royal, a peer of the realm and an illegal immigrant walked along the road, do as the illegal immigrant did. It's hard to convey the level of shock, the audible gasps that would have gone round the gathered people. And by making the hero of the story a Samaritan rather than a Jew, Jesus is saying the kingdom of God is bigger than this small group of people. Salvation will come through the Jews, but it isn't just for the Jews. Grace is bigger than nationalism and populism. Your neighbour isn't just someone who looks like you and believes what you do. Your neighbour is anyone who needs your help. And we have a responsibility to love our neighbour today, even the neighbour that arrives on our shores in a small boat. We have a responsibility to love our neighbour, even the one that gets a council house before your friends, your children, your whoever. We have a responsibility to love our neighbour today, even if you think they're a man but they choose to dress and act like a woman. We have a responsibility to love our neighbour today, even if you don't agree with the person that they are in love with. We have a responsibility to love our neighbour. That hasn't changed. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. On this hangs all the law and the prophets. There was a meme, a picture going around on social media a while ago that was absolutely brilliant. I'm going to read it to you this morning. It says this: love thy neighbour, thy homeless neighbour, thy black neighbour, thy Muslim neighbour, thy gay neighbour, thy white neighbour, thy Jewish neighbour, thy Christian neighbour, thy atheist neighbour, thy racist neighbour, thy addicted neighbour. We could probably add some more to that list, couldn't we? And honestly, hand on heart, some of those people are not very lovable. I find some of those neighbours easier to love than others. But why should we love them? Well, I've got two reasons. Firstly, because Jesus told us to. And the Bible tells us, doesn't it, we're not just to read the word, but to do what it says. But secondly, Because we were once the person in the gutter. Every single one of us. We ourselves were half dead. We were helpless. We had no way of saving ourselves. And then along came Jesus and he rescued us. He picked us up. And for some of us, that was massive. Some of us have huge testimonies of how Jesus transformed our lives, of how we were heading for destruction. And Jesus came and he rescued us from death. And he bandaged us up. And he paid the price for our healing. And he saved us. None of us is here because of our own merit. Not one of us can stand before the throne of God because we deserve it. Not one. Lord, if you marked our transgressions, who could stand? Well, not me, that's for sure. But Jesus met me on the road when I was helpless and headed for death, when I was beaten and defeated. And he picked me up, and he loved me, and he healed me, and he saved me, and he sent me out to do the same for others. That's why I tell people about Jesus. God, forgive me when I walk past on the other side of the road. So this morning, church, who is your neighbour? Who needs practical help? And who needs to know how much God loves them, even them? This is huge stuff, church. The Jews were not going to be allowed to keep God to themselves, and we are not allowed to keep God to ourselves. God is not just the God of Southwell Baptist Church or of Kings Lynn Baptist Church. He's not just the God of the Baptist Union of Great Britain, even though Baptists are obviously his favourite. God is not just even the God of the Christians. He is the God of the whole world. And his grace is big enough, even for the Samaritan. His grace is big enough, even for me. His grace is big enough, even for the greatest sinner. Which one was a neighbour to the man who had fallen into the hands of the robbers? Go you then and do likewise. We're going to sing now. It's a real favourite of mine, and I hope at least some of you know it. It's a song that speaks of what God has done for us. When I was lost, you came and rescued me, reached down into the pit and lifted me. Oh Lord, such love. I was as far from you as I could be. It's a song that recognises that we were lost, we were broken, we were half dead, we were in a pit, we were defeated. But Jesus came and rescued us and lifted us out and set us on solid ground. It's a reminder of who we were, of what Jesus has done, and to spur us on to go and do likewise for others. Bless you, church.